Hello, Zest here. Files, Fear, and Federal Fists. FDR and the FBI, Part 1 Introduction. In the grand pantheon of American political mythology, that vast cathedral of collective self-deception where Washington never told a lie and Lincoln freed the slaves out of pure Christian charity, no figure looms larger than Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, that aristocratic savior of the common man who somehow managed to rescue capitalism from itself while wearing a cape made of New Deal legislation. The mythology is as sturdy as it is preposterous. FDR, friend of the forgotten man, savior and champion of the working class, the man who gave us social security and told the fat cats to go jump in a lake. The masses, weary from the Great Depression's grim parade, hailed him as the great emancipator of the working stiff. Roosevelt was the grinning sphinx of American liberalism, perched atop the New Deal, a series of programs and reforms promising salvation to millions of downtrodden Americans. His New Deal was sold as a lifeline to the common man, bread for the hungry, jobs for the idle, and a megaphone for the voiceless. But beneath this glittering facade lurked a grim jest, a sleight of hand worthy of a coyote trickster. This popular narrative masks a murkier reality, one in which the federal government, under Roosevelt's watchful eye, coordinated with industrial interests and deep state authorities to suppress the labor movement. While FDR was busy handing out breadcrumbs as he waved the flag of labor with one hand, the other directed a full-scale war against organized labor, signing off a clandestine crusade to kneecap the very workers he claimed to champion. It's rather like a doctor who treats your headache while secretly poisoning your water supply, therapeutic and homicidal simultaneously, a perfect expression of the American genius for contradiction. Central to FDR's legacy, in 1935, his administration unfurled the National Labor Relations Act, or Wagner Act, with all the pomp of a circus parade. It guaranteed the right of private sector workers to organize, bargain collectively, and strike without fear of the boss's boot. A grand gesture, no doubt, and one that earned FDR hosannas from the proletariat. However, the universe delights in paradox, for behind this noble edict, the gears of repression were grinding. This public-facing support for labor coexisted with a more clandestine and antagonistic reality. While FDR's rhetoric soared with talk of the forgotten man, his administration's enforcers were busy ensuring those same men stayed forgotten, or at least safely muzzled. He waged a systematic campaign against the American labor movement. Labor is a four-letter word. Enter the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, chaired by the indomitable J. Edgar Hoover, that eternal Washington fixture who possessed all the charm of a Victorian mortician and twice the paranoia. Behind the veneer of New Deal progressivism was the heart of an anti-union campaign led by the indefatigable, ever-watchful, gimlet-eyed Hoover, who gazed upon the American labor movement with the kind of suspicious dread that a medieval monk might reserve for a particularly voluptuous succubus. To his fevered imagination, he saw union halls as dens of Bolshevik vipers and treated every picket line as a prelude to revolution, and every collective bargaining session, a communist cell meeting disguised as a social gathering. He was less a guardian of justice than a cudgel for the industrial barons. Hoover, that self-styled sentinel of American virtue, viewed labor unions with the same enthusiasm one reserves for a plague of locusts. To him, a strike for better wages was no different from a Kremlin plot, and a union organizer with a whiff of socialism was as dangerous as a saboteur with a dynamite stick. This was no mere bureaucratic prejudice. It was a philosophy, elevated to the level of religious doctrine. The ideological foundation for the FBI's anti-labor stance was firmly established by Hoover. For him, the category of enemy extended beyond criminals to include advocates for labor leaders, whom he believed should be kept in jail regardless of the circumstances of their conviction. This philosophy illustrates an intrinsic bias against labor leadership and a desire to see it neutralized by the carceral state. In a notable speech at the 1935 meeting of the International Association of Chiefs of Police, a gathering that must have resembled a convention of professional thumbbreakers, Hoover articulated this position with chilling clarity. He thundered against anyone who supported efforts to defend jailed labor leaders or secure pardons, branding them enemies of society. The implication was deliciously clear. Labor leaders belonged in cages, preferably permanent ones, regardless of such trifling concerns as evidence or due process. Why? The very idea of a pardon for a Union man was an affront to Hoover's ironclad moral universe. Evidence be damned. Labor is a subversive threat. Far from being a neutral arm of justice, the FBI in the 1930s and 1940s functioned as a tool of repression against American workers struggling for basic rights. Hoover conflated labor militancy, radical politics, and anti-government sentiment into a single monolithic threat of subversion. This worldview was not a secret. It was a core component of his public identity. His Hoover doctrine branded labor militancy as a sinister bogeyman. Under the pretense of rooting out subversive activity and fascist threats, the Bureau systematically targeted unions, their leaders, and any grassroots organizing that threatened to disrupt the existing power structure. During this period, the FBI worked against the interests of the American working class in favor of industrialists and the government, employing tactics of surveillance, legal manipulation, and public vilification to suppress union activity. This view was further codified in Hoover's official capacity. By November 1939, Roosevelt had officially blessed his paranoid vision, authorizing him to compile detailed dossiers on anyone engaged in subversive activity, a term left deliberately vague, like a legal document written in invisible ink. It could mean anything from reading Marx to demanding a lunch break. Authorized by Roosevelt himself, this program was ostensibly about national security, sniffing out spies and fascists. In practice, this meant surveilling anyone who had the temerity to suggest that workers might deserve a living wage, or the radical notion that employers shouldn't be permitted to treat their workforce like medieval serfs. Testifying before the House Appropriations Committee, Hoover announced that President Roosevelt had authorized him to compile detailed records on individuals and organizations involved in subversive activity. The term in practice included most labor unions. It was also framed as a measure for national security against espionage and foreign intrigue, but the practical application of this directive was overwhelmingly aimed at domestic dissent, with organized labor being a primary target, especially those advocating for industrial unionism, racial integration, or political radicalism. For the FBI, a strike for better wages could be framed as an attempt to disrupt critical industries, and a union organizer with socialist sympathies was no different than a foreign agent. Facade of fascism. Now here's where the cosmic comedy reaches truly sublime heights. In the late 1930s, as genuine Nazis and fascists were goose-stepping across Europe, and their American sympathizers were holding rallies in Madison Square Garden, the FBI made a great show of investigating right-wing extremism, some of whom openly admired Mussolini and Hitler. However, historical analysis reveals this to be largely a pretense. The FBI's true focus was elsewhere. The Bureau's nose was far keener for Union halls than for Nazi sympathizers. They poked around the German-American Bund with all the enthusiasm of a cat investigating a cucumber. Lots of theatrical posturing, minimal actual engagement. While some investigations into the German-American Bund and their ilk did occur, the Bureau's institutional energy, resources, and focus remained intensely fixed on the political left, and by extension, the labor movement and their firebrand leaders. Meanwhile, union halls, strike meetings, and working-class neighborhoods were infiltrated and crawling with more FBI informants than a J. Edgar Hoover birthday party. The Bureau's resources were orchestrated like a symphony in full harmony, Fascist sympathizers received gentle inquiries, got a cursory glance, often treated with tolerance or, at worst, indifference, while labor organizers got the full treatment: surveillance, infiltration, and harassment that would make a Stalinist secret police chief weep with envy. This selective blindness wasn't accidental, it was artistic. The FBI had perfected the art of appearing to combat extremism while actually serving as the enforcement arm of capital. It's rather like a fire department that responds to house fires by hosing down the neighbors, while the actual blaze consumes everything in sight. Labor organizers were painted as radicals, communists, or outright enemies of the state. Moreover, a mud-throwing campaign was spearheaded by the FBI aimed to discredit union leaders through the press and courtroom spectacle, branding them as dangerous agitators, foreign agents, or criminals without substantial evidence. The temerity to strike for better pay? Why, that was a clear and present danger to the Republic. A socialist-leaning organizer, practically a Soviet agent in overalls. To wit, the real victims of the FBI's subversive activities program were not fascists, but union members, organizers, and leaders, particularly those associated with the more militant Congress of Industrial Organizations, CIO. This selective targeting demonstrated that the Bureau's mission was not the neutral protection of American democracy from all extremist threats, but the specific suppression of working-class movements that challenged the existing economic, power, and political order. Suppression, surveillance, and sly provocateurs. The FBI's tactics were as brazen as a vaudeville act, with the charm of a tax audit. Their methods were intrusive and inflammatory. The Bureau issued public requests, nay, commanded citizens to snitch on labor gatherings, working-class meetings, parades, and demonstrations to their local FBI field office. Every union meeting, every strike rally, every gathering of more than 3 workers discussing anything more controversial than the weather became a potential federal case. FBI agents swarmed labor gatherings like particularly well-dressed hyenas. The stated purpose was to monitor for potential disturbances, but the operational reality was to ensure that FBI snoopers were present at every significant labor gathering and generally ensuring that collective action carried all the privacy of a public execution. Agents slunk into union meetings, scribbling names and lists of attendees, identifying leaders, and reporting on speeches and strategies like overzealous stenographers at a witch trial. They created a vast intelligence database on labor activists. This climate of surveillance and intimidation made collective action a perilous undertaking, turning every rally into a potential trap. The Bureau's role often went beyond passive surveillance, and when passive snooping wasn't enough, they rolled out the agents provocateurs, sly foxes sent to stir up trouble and give the cops an excuse to crack skulls. Planted in the ranks like poisonous flowers, actively encouraging violence and unlawful behavior to justify the inevitable crackdown. Rather than de-escalate tensions, the Bureau actively inflamed them. These undercover agents would infiltrate unions and strike committees with the explicit goal of creating internal divisions. This tactic served a dual purpose. It created a pretext for a violent police crackdown, and it helped to discredit the union in the media and the public eye, painting a legitimate labor dispute as a dangerous, radical-led riot. The Minneapolis WPA strike provides a perfect example of this technique. During this strike, FBI plants didn't just infiltrate but actively fanned the flames, seeking to provoke incidents, hoping to spark violence that could justify mass arrests and indictments. The FBI didn't just watch the strike unfold, they helped write the script, directing the drama toward maximum chaos and minimum sympathy for the strikers. It's governmental theater at its finest. Create the crisis, then swoop in as the solution. The ultimate goal? Paint every labor dispute as a debauchery led by bomb-throwing radicals, ripe for the front page of every yellow rag in the land.